Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. A group commonly known as the Sullivanians was an urban commune in New York City in the second half of the 20th century that attempted to create a utopian community based on free love, psychological self-actualization, and communism. At the heart of its philosophy was a psychoanalysis theory that culture is the root of mental illness. The group attempted to break up the traditional nuclear family within it, and what began as an attempt to build a better world turned into what some would probably describe as a totalitarian nightmare for many, though not all. People who were involved with the Sullivanians have had different views about it over the years. My guest today has talked to many of them. My guest is Alexander Stille. He is a San Paolo professor of international journalism at Columbia University, and he joins us for a conversation about his book. It's called The Sullivanians: Sex, Psychotherapy, and the Wild Life of an American Commune. Alexander Stille, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thanks for having me.
This group begins in the 1950s. This is sort of, at least as we look back on it and remember, sort of the Leave It to Beaver kind of era, sort of the nuclear family at its height. Is this, the Sullivanians, is this group kind of a rejection of that time?
Yeah, I think very much so. As you point out, the 1950s is like the high point of a certain version of the traditional family. After World War II, people were marrying younger, having more children. In the kind of economic boom, men could afford to be the sole breadwinner, and the wife stayed home with a house full of new appliances and took care of the kids. And that was kind of the model. It was father knows best, Donna Reed, and so forth. And so this group represented, these people were, the people who founded it were two psychotherapists who were already sort of communists in the 1930s. There was a kind of bohemian underground that already existed that sort of resisted that kind of Leave It to Beaver culture. And the world was about to change, and I think they sensed that. So underneath the kind of dominant, father knows best world, you had the Beat Generation beginning to happen, Howl and On the Road and Rebel Without a Cause, the Algerian Revolution, the Cuban Revolution beginning. And these people were very attuned to all of that. And they had been exposed to the work of a psychotherapist named Harry Stack Sullivan, who was provided an interesting variation on Freud, rather than thinking that everything important happened in the first 3 years of life, and basically your life was determined by your early dynamic with your parents and the id and the ego and superego and all that stuff, that people continued to developed during the course of their lifetime, that those social circumstances were important to making them who they were, that people grew through contact with other people and continued growing into adulthood. Sullivan had treated schizophrenics who many traditional psychotherapists didn't think were worth treating, had success with them by treating them in group settings in which male schizophrenic patients lived with each other, with a sympathetic staff of people who treated them with dignity. And so this kind of interaction and common life was seen as very healing. And so these sort of maverick psychotherapists who started the Sullivan Institute, Harry Stack Sullivan was dead by the time they did this, but they were inspired by his work, and they thought, why shouldn't everybody else benefit from things that work for schizophrenics? People need fellowship, they need company, they need exposure to multiple people. Why shouldn't they live communally? If people grew through exposure to multiple people, then by definition the family was limiting, because there might be 4 or 5 people in your family rather than the multitude of people that would make you grow as people. A monogamous marriage was seen as by definition limiting, that it would become a kind of possessive, jealous prison house rather than the kind of expansive world of growth that they imagined. And so they began advising their patients to break off ties with their families of origin, have sex with a multitude of different partners, and eventually they encourage their patients to live with each other in large group apartments on the Upper West Side, women with women, men with men, in a sense following the Sullivan model with the schizophrenics. Men with men and men with women, in part in order to avoid traditional families from forming where men and women would have children and raise them as families. And so they had, even when patients were married, they would live in separate apartments and, trade off parenting duties, and meanwhile maintain sexual relationships with a multitude of different partners. So this evolved into a kind of large urban commune during the 1960s. Not coincidentally, this was also the period of the sexual revolution. The year that they begin operating, 1957, is the year that the FDA begins considering the application for the birth control pill, which is then authorized in 1960. So all this kind of, to these people, I think, represented the opportunity of changing the way in which we live. Their view was, through most of human history, our lives have been limited by biology. The fact that there's no birth control means that if I want to guarantee that my child is my child, I need to jealously guard the chastity of my wife. I need to keep her under wraps. It's sort of tied up with the inheritance of property and patrimony and all this stuff. And they said, now we're free of all this. What if we simply arrange society to make us happier rather than for all these other things that have nothing to do with our personal happiness? And so we can now rewrite the rules of society. And of course, this is not unlike many things that were happening in the 1960s. These were not the only people that, wanted to rewrite the script.
Certainly not the only commune, but
yes.
One of the rare communes in an urban setting, right?
Yeah, that's what I think is so interesting about this group, is that rather than being in an ashram in India or rural Vermont or Oregon, these people were doing this in the middle of America's densest city, New York City, on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And that's also not coincidental. New York was losing population very rapidly during the 50s and 60s. There was kind of white flight from the city to the suburbs, and New York lost 1 million people. Manhattan lost 500,000 people. And these big, the Upper West Side of Manhattan has these big pre-World War II buildings that were built for, large families and upper middle class houses. And they were now being vacated and suddenly renting for next to nothing. And so students and graduate students, people who were patients of the Sullivan Institute could move in. And if you knocked down a wall between two apartments, you had a communal space for 10 or 12 people. So all this kind of began to develop during this period of change and turmoil in New York.
And yet, even though it's in the middle of one of the most populated cities of all the world at its time, it's still a very secretive group and closed group.
Yeah. Well, the thing that's interesting is that because they felt that they were really onto something, and that the rest of society was too corrupt, too stupid to appreciate it, they were afraid that the FBI might begin investigating them, that they were going to get closed down. And so they were very secretive, even though it was a sort of funny open secret, because people in Manhattan, particularly on the Upper West Side, knew about it. It was this kind of, you'd see people on the street corner in the West 70s, West 80s of Manhattan with date books, writing down appointments that they were making with other people. And people would say, oh, who are these people? Oh, they're the Sullivanians. They've got this whole thing going. And then they had parties every Friday and Saturday night. And that's how they recruited people. So people would come to these parties and they'd see all these really nice, smart, attractive young people in their 20s, dancing and having a good time and going to bed with each other. And younger people thought, wow, this looks great. And many people sort of got into it that way, or they came into it through therapy. They were, let's say 23, 24, going through a bit of a life crisis, trying to, a break from their parents, and found their own life. They decided they needed some therapy. They got into this, and suddenly they learned that their therapist had a different approach to therapy. The therapist would then encourage them to join a men's group or a women's group, to go to a party, to meet people, since the part of the therapy was you need to get out and circulate, you need to meet people. And so what these people offered, which I think was really interesting and quite appealing to a lot of people, is they weren't just offering therapy, they were offering a way of life. And so if you were in an uncertain position in your life, that was a pretty attractive thing. These people, the group also had, the therapist had a bunch of houses out on Long Island, which is about 2 hours drive from Manhattan. And the patients would go in on summer shares, in which you might have 15 or 20 people sharing a house with 5 or 6 bedrooms, and they'd all crash there on weekends or come out on alternate weekends and have parties, and again continue circulating, dating, hanging out with the therapists. So it was a pretty pleasant, kind of pleasant lifestyle for people in the late 60s, early 70s.
Now, the two founders, as you mentioned, Jane Pierce and Sal Newton. Jane Pierce was a student of Harry Stack Sullivan, who they're named after, the Sullivanians. But again, probably you mentioned this, but I just want to underline it. Harry Stack Sullivan had died before this group was founded.
That's right. Yeah, he died in 1949, and it's not quite clear when they began practicing independently, but the institute, the Sullivan Institute, officially incorporates in 1957. However, they were already seeing patients with their own approach before that. One of the interesting cases of an early patient is the painter Jackson Pollock, who got into therapy in 1955. And Pollock was brought into it by the famous art critic Clement Greenberg, who was at the time sort of the Pope of abstract expressionism, the Pope of modern art criticism in New York. And he had a whole stable of artists that he championed, and who became sort of like the leaders of the abstract expressionist movement in the 50s and 60s in New York. And he basically encouraged all of them to go into Sullivanian therapy, even though, in Pollock's case, it ended quite tragically because his Sullivanian therapist did not address Pollock's very heavy drinking problem. Pollock was an alcoholic well before getting into therapy, but the therapist did not see alcoholism as its own problem. He simply said, your problem is your mother, your problem is something having to do with your life. Drinking is neither here nor there. And so
was that commonly thought of by the group about drinking?
That was common. Yeah, that was a big belief of theirs, that in fact alcohol could be quite positive, that alcohol was disinhibiting, was a way of relieving anxiety. And so they didn't treat patients like Jackson Pollock. Also, the singer Judy Collins had a very serious drinking problem, and she said, she had the same therapist that treated Jackson Pollock, and she said he didn't understand anything about drinking, that my problem was not that I was drinking because I was depressed because I was drinking. And you have to actually deal with alcoholism as its own issue, and then you can start to deal with the other life issues that a patient may have. So they had it backwards, in a sense, of what people would now generally, how people would generally handle alcohol.
And the group was called please.
Yeah. So Pollock kept drinking and also had an extramarital affair, and then tragically was driving blind drunk with this woman, and a friend of hers crashed the car, killed himself and the woman passenger. So that's how that ended.
What was the effect on the Commune?
It had no effect. What's interesting is that Clement Greenberg, who had advised Pollock to get into therapy, this did not shake his conviction in the rightness of Sullivanian therapy. So Greenberg remained in therapy and continued to advise his artist friends to get into therapy, and that continued into the 1970s.
So again, the group's called the Sullivan Institute for Research and Psychoanalysis. We talked about Jane Pierce, again, student of Harry Stack Sullivan. Her co-founder and husband, Sal Newton, we haven't really talked about yet. Previously, Sal Newton was a communist organizer.
Yeah, he was a labor organizer in Chicago. He'd done a little bit.
So not communist, or is there a distinction?
Yeah, he was communist.
Yeah.
He was. No, he was definitely a communist. And he went and fought in the Spanish Civil War in the mid-1930s, which was a great badge of honor on the American left. There were only, I think, 2,800 Americans who went over to fight in Spain. Most of them were communists, not all. So that gave him a lot of credibility with people on the left. So even though he did not have a degree in psychotherapy, he did do courses in social work. What his training was is not clear. He then worked in a clerical job at the White Institute, which was an institute, psychoanalytic institute in New York that Harry Stack Sullivan founded, together with a lot of other famous psychotherapists, including Erich Fromm, Frieda Fromm-Reichmann, a woman named Clara Thompson. And so Newton had some exposure to the ideas of Sullivan, but it's not clear whether he actually received any training. The records of the White Institute, sadly, were destroyed in a flood. So that remains kind of a mystery. But he did not have a degree, he did not have a formal training. His wife, actually his fourth wife, Jane Pierce, had both a PhD, had both an MD and training from the White Institute as a psychotherapist. So she was fully trained, but they became a couple. And in the late 1940s, and then they decide to break off on their own because they've decided that after the death of Harry Stack Sullivan, the White Institute has become too conservative, too cautious, and they think they are pushing Harry Stack Sullivan's ideas where they really needed to go, even though Sullivan himself didn't push him that far. Sullivan didn't have his patients cutting off ties with their family, living with each other, having lots of sex. But they saw this idea of interpersonal psychotherapy, the idea that we grow from exposure to other people, as requiring the kind of practices that they then undertook.
Was there a mending of the work from Harry Stack Sullivan? And I guess we sort of consider neo-Freudism. You could take on that term if you want or not. But
So Sullivan would be considered a neo-Freudian. Lots of people were trying to customize the work of Freud to to the conditions of life, and to amend it in ways that were more convincing to them. And so the idea that Sullivan, for example, worked with sociologists. He considered psychotherapy as a social science. He did work with a famous Black sociologist who wrote about life in the Black Belt of Black people in the Black Belt of the South. Sullivan understood that, maybe growing up in a segregated society might have a bigger effect on your psyche than your Oedipus complex. And so Sullivan was more socially attuned, and that would have been appealing to these, sort of socialist communist psychotherapists. And they took the idea that you continue to grow into adulthood very seriously. Sullivan had a rather lonely childhood, and Freud, for example, doesn't deal with the problem of loneliness, and Sullivan did. Sullivan came up with an idea that he called chumship, that there was a stage of your life you have when you're very small, you engage in parallel play with your playmates. When you're, let's say, 1 or 2, children play alongside of one another, kind of mirroring each other. And then they go into, when they reach around 9, 10, 11, they go into a phase that Sullivan called chumship, where often children develop very close friendships with people of their own sex, whom they're very, very close to. And those relationships are very important in terms of a child's socialization. And Sullivan posited that people often miss out on that in some cases because their life is too isolated. Their parents break up their childhood friendships or things of that kind. And he theorized that people could recover those lost phases of development later in life. So you might be in your 20s and you could experience chumship with other people that you weren't necessarily sexually involved with. And so the followers of Sullivan, the Sullivanians, very much liked that idea. So the idea of living in group apartments with people of your same sex was a way of promoting fellowship and essentially recreating chumships among people who were already adults. So that was kind of the idea.
Is there a blending of psychoanalysis and Marxism?
Although the therapy by itself didn't necessarily include that, but I think their idea was that you couldn't have real socialism or real communism without a new kind of person. That, in other words, the thing that the Soviet Union or other experiments in socialism had failed to do was to break up the family. So they had changed the economic system, but it was important to also change people's psychology. So their idea was the family was a pillar of the capitalist establishment. So your parents are training you to be good, productive citizens, to show up on time, to go to school, to do all the things that are going to make you a reliable citizen so that you can go out and work in a job and keep the capitalist system going. So they saw that the nuclear family as being the kind of enforcer or agent of the capitalist system. So one of the ways of creating socialism was to knock down that pillar and break up that system. So that's kind of what they thought they were doing. So this way, you're training people not to be possessive. You're training people to live communally, to share, to create a different set of non-possessive, non-materialistic values. So that's the way in which I think their socialism or Marxism was incorporated into the psychotherapy.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Alexander Stille. Alexander Stille is the author of the book, The Sullivanians, Sex, Psychotherapy, and the Wild Life of an American Commune. He's also the San Paolo Professor of International Journalism at Columbia University. You interviewed a lot of people about this book, and you also relied on archives, as good journalists would. I want to talk about the people that you interviewed, and I said in my introduction, many people have different views about this group.
Yes, well, there are people that were in this group for 20 plus years who remain quite faithful and are convinced that, all things considered, whatever its defects might be, this was an exciting alternative way of living, and they're glad they did it. There are people who regard this as the worst, most traumatic experience of their life, and you have lots of shades of nuance in between those two extremes. One thing that we haven't discussed that I think is important is that because the group was committed to breaking up the family, children were a particular problem. And so when their first patients went into therapy in the 50s and 60s, some of them were adults who already had children. In those cases, they advised their patients to send their kids away to boarding school. In some cases, these kids were 7, 6, 5, in one case, even 3 years old. Places that you would send children that young were really not equipped to deal with children of that age, and some of them were really brutal places to grow up in. They also tried to keep the patients from seeing their children for more than a few days a year. So even when they were in boarding school, often they were forced during the summertime or Christmas break to find other places to live during vacation. And so they almost never saw their children. Those people's lives were really, really negatively affected. And those people bear a lot of scars and are in some cases extremely bitter. So, funnily enough, some of those people feel that I wasn't even hard enough in my book on the group because they suffered so much. Other people who stayed to the end felt I was too hard. Hey, I got a lot of good things out of this experience. I made a lot of friends whom I'm still friends with. I had more fun and more sociability in my life than most Americans do. So yes, there were some abuses, some things that went wrong, but all things considered, I benefited from this. So you really have a range of experiences among the people that were part of this.
To have a principal tenant be to break up the family sounds extreme, obviously.
Yeah,
How did it make
right.
sense to the people?
Well, I think their view, I mean, I think it's complicated to know what their motivation was. Initially, there really was, I think, an idealistic motivation that breaking up the family was going to be good for both the children and the parents. That um, if, if parents, as they believed, invariably visit their own neurosis and trauma onto their children, you're sparing the children by removing them from that situation and having them be raised in a more communal setting. At the same time, I think it was also, as Saul Newton became increasingly the dominant figure in this group, I think this was also a source of power for him, the idea that you could do this to other people, that you could crack the whip and have them jump and have them do this. It was also a way of, I think, I don't know that they planned to have a cult, but it ended up playing very nicely into the kind of cult playbook. When people are isolated and they don't have family ties, they don't have ties with their families of origin or even with their spouse, it's much easier to control people. And after a while, one of the patients who'd sent her kid away to boarding school very young lost custody of her child in a battle with the child's father. They then started doing some very weird stuff with the kids. They would have women conceive collectively. In other words, have sex with multiple men during ovulation period, so you wouldn't know who the dad was. Again, justified by trying to break the bonds of possessive ownership of children by parents. But it was also a way of destabilizing things and keeping people off balance. And in some cases, they reassigned children to other parents, had children raised in group apartments rather than by their own biological parents. And for the kids, in some cases, this was really disastrous.
They never knew who their father was.
They didn't know who their father was. And one of the interesting things during the course of the research of my book, the people that I was interviewing were making discoveries in real time, so that simultaneous to my own reporting, they were all learning things about their lives as I was reporting my book. So one of my main characters discovered that he had 3 biological children that he didn't know about while I was doing my research. And so, I arrived at one of my interviews with him, and he said, "So I think you probably heard the same rumors about, my being the biological dad of kids, but I don't want to talk about that. So turn off your tape recorder, but it's true." And then maybe a month or two later, he said, "Okay, I'm ready to talk about paternity. We'll come and do another interview because I realized this is actually really important. And it's made me understand my life in this group in a way that I didn't." So that was also super, super interesting to be involved in a kind of voyage of discovery along with my own interview subjects.
Is any of this illegal at the time? I mean, I'm part of me is like, well, is there a child protective service? Now, you interview some kids who actually very much enjoyed being a part of this commune as a child.
Yeah, some did. I mean, interestingly, one of the people who was one of the bigger supporters of the group and feels that he had a really rich, interesting childhood was taken away from first his mother and then from his father and raised in a group apartment with 10 adult men who were not his blood relatives. But 7 of them had PhDs. And they were really nice people, and they treated him kindly. And so he feels like he had a really rich, interesting childhood that was not like the childhood of most people. So on the other hand, I think more people of the kids, very, very few of the kids I interviewed, I say kids because they were kids at the time, they're now people in their 30s, 40s, 50s. Almost none of them would say, "I would raise a child this way," or, "I think I would have been better off living with my parents growing up." So I think that part of it is, that part of their legacy is pretty negative. people who came into it as adults, you can argue, in a sense, are responsible for their own experience. They chose this. And so you can say, all right, maybe it didn't work out perfectly, but you made your choices. For the kids who didn't have any choice in the matter, it's sort of hard to see this as anything but being pretty negative.
There would be a number of lawsuits that would help bring an end to this group.
Yeah, there were
91.
lawsuits, but interesting. You asked the question about whether it was criminal. I think in today's age, you would have had action taken. Certainly, Saul Newton, who engaged in a lot of sexual abuse of his patients and of the female therapist that he supervised, would probably be in the cell next to Harvey Weinstein's in prison right now. But interestingly, a lot of what they did was not illegal in the sense that some of the therapists actually were licensed therapists with PhDs or MDs. And so they had licenses, and 4 of them lost their licenses in the late 1980s and early 1990s because of the rules they broke in standard practice of therapy. But Saul Newton himself did not have, because he didn't have formal training, he had no license to lose. I mean, one of the funny things that I learned in the course of working on this book is that anybody can call themselves a psychotherapist. If someone is willing to pay you to listen to them, you're a psychotherapist. The only thing you can't do is they can't get reimbursed by an insurance company because you don't have a degree. But if you don't care about reimbursement, anybody can, put out a shingle and say, I'm a psychotherapist. And so that's in effect what Saul Newton did. And they began training younger people in the 1970s, and they had about a dozen or more people who were only trained by them, had no certification, and were treating their patients. And that became a real source of power for Saul Newton and for the people at the leadership of the Institute, because these were young people who had no source of employment outside of the group. They depended on their living situation, their income, and their social life on the leadership of the group. So if one of the top therapists said, tell your patient to break off their relationship with this person, not to have a child, to do whatever it is they thought should be done, that person almost invariably did it. They were really at the mercy of the leadership.
Saul Newton and Jane Pierce would break up. They would get divorced. Does Saul Newton hold on to power of this group?
Very much so. So Jane Pierce, whom I think really was motivated by idealistic aims, is pushed out of the leadership by like 1979. And Newton goes on to marry 2 other women with whom he lives and with whom he has children. And they're wives number 5 and 6. And so he and they and another man who was also a Sullivanian therapist all lived together in a large group apartment with about 30 people in a building in Manhattan. And they become the real dominant leadership. And Saul Newton is definitely the first among equals, the most powerful even of the 4 leadership people. And what becomes kind of tragic in a sense is this group that had sort of liberating aspects to it that was free and fun and exciting for many people in the late 60s, early 70s, becomes increasingly top-down and controlling by the late 1970s. The group, for example, because the group had lots of really creative people in it, they had rock bands, they had painting classes, they had a theater group, they had a comedy group, and all this sort of creative activity kind of bubbling up from the bottom. And in 1977, they said, hey, wait a second, we need to be all under one tent. And so all these different groups should merge into one group under the name of the theater company they'd started, which was called the Fourth Wall Repertory Company. And So the leadership took over all the creative activity. They bought a theater in New York on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. They bought a property up in the Catskills where everyone could hang out during the summertime and rehearse and perform. And everybody had to then start paying dues. And because these properties cost money, and so everybody had to pitch in, you now had to contribute time. So the whole thing became much more structured. There were actual formal leadership, membership lists, which I was able to obtain. And you paid dues every month. So it was really became a formal structure with a leadership on top and everybody else down at the bottom. So that was a really important change in which what was really a bottom-up kind of group suddenly became very much of a top-down group.
Alexander Stille is our guest. He is the author of the book, The Sullivanians, Sex, Psychotherapy, and the Wild Life of an American Commune. Then do we see an evolution then of Sal Newton to become more totalitarian? And is totalitarian the correct way to describe how he would emerge?
Yeah, I think it's a reasonable term in the sense that what many of the people who were even therapists in the group at that time told me is initially we were trained to promote the self-fulfillment of our patients. Increasingly, we were being told to make people become good soldiers for the group. So it was much more about the group and less about the individuals who were in therapy. If the leadership decided that you weren't supposed to have children, the therapist would be preventing people from having children. Or if they decided that they wanted to take a child away from its biological parent, the therapist would be enforcing that. The therapists were making decisions about who lived in what apartment. They would start, breaking up relationships that became too close. That involves, what jobs they increasingly advise people to give up. Many of these people were sort of in the creative professions. And so they pushed a lot of those patients who didn't necessarily earn a lot of money to become computer programmers. And this was kind of the beginning of the computer revolution. And so those jobs were much more lucrative. And so many people gave up their work as, being an artist or a social worker or something like that, and became computer programmers so that they could contribute more money to the welfare of the group. So it was much more about the group and the accumulation of power at the top. And then also, as I mentioned, they were much more aggressive about reassigning children. There are like several women that were, forced to give up their children in the early 1980s. And that's ultimately what kind of broke the group up. There was a woman who had a child in 1985 at the age of 41. So she finally gets to have a child. And then at 3 months, her therapist said, you've got to stop breastfeeding. It's bad for the child, bad for you. You're too possessive. You're so possessive that we don't think you should see your child. And so the child is assigned to a babysitter. The mother doesn't get to see her daughter for 6 months. She's living in the same building with her husband, who lives on another floor, with the babysitter who lives on yet another floor. The child is there and she can't see it. She is becoming increasingly distraught, and she finally sees a lawyer who says, look, you have to actually kidnap your own child. That's how you're going to get her back. You as a mother have a right to your child, so it's not kidnapping. She hires 2 bodyguards, and they immobilize the babysitter when she comes out to take the child out for a walk. And she runs off and goes into hiding, and that prompts a legal battle, which sort of divides the group and begins sort of the beginning of the end. Then there are other lawsuits that follow that are similar in nature, in which parents who are not in the group want to get their children back.
Why did she go into hiding?
Because they were afraid that, and they were not wrong, members of the group formed kind of surveillance posses to look for her, to actually wanted to take the children back. There are 3 instances that I was able to document where parents who had left the group were actually, the group members formed a kind of posse in which they actually took children away from their other parents. So it was not an unfounded fear. Um, so
Did the group employ violence?
In small doses. Not, I mean, what's interesting is the group stopped short of, we all are aware of groups like, Jim Jones' group in which they commit mass suicide in Guyana, or Heaven's Gate in which they also commit suicide waiting for aliens from space to pick them up. This group got increasingly violent, but it stopped well short of the kind of apocalyptic violence that would have, put this on the front page of newspapers around the country. They did, for example, they ransacked the building right next to the building that they owned on 100th Street in New York because they felt the people in that building were being disrespectful of them. And so they literally came in with sledgehammers and trashed the entire building and ripped it apart. So that was obviously violent. When one of the important therapists in the group defected and began helping other people to defect, two people from the group attacked him in a New York subway and held him over the tracks and said, "You keep doing this and you're going to end up underneath a train." That was certainly violent, but they didn't throw him under the train. Another person was beaten up. There were a few kind of beatings that took place, but it didn't cross over the threshold into the kind of lethal violence that would have brought the whole thing to a kind of final conflagration.
Yeah, I have to be honest, as I was preparing for our conversation, I had never heard of the Sullivanians, so I approached this as probably obvious in the course of our conversation. I've definitely approached this as somebody new to it. And, and as I'm reading along and getting more into the story, I'm sort of expecting some kind of mass suicide or murder or something like that. Like, is this going to happen? What's good? And nothing like that actually does happen. I mean, this really comes apart because of a number of lawsuits.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing that is interesting is that this is a group that was committed to breaking up the family. And then ultimately it's the family that breaks up the group. It's the bonds between people, people who had been in this group for 10 or 15 years were tired of, after a while, you've had enough free sex and you want to settle down with somebody that you really care about. And suddenly the group was making that impossible to do. You're sneaking around to see the person that you really care about. You want to have a child and you see that children are being taken away from their parents and you don't want to take that risk by having a child with somebody under those circumstances. So those are the things that end up really breaking up the group of people who were trying to recover their children, people who wanted to have a family outside of the interference of the group. Those are the things that really bring down the group in the end, rather than, and it's interesting. The people in this group were very smart, interesting people. I think one of the reasons why it didn't end up in the kind of conflagration that one might have expected is that what makes this group interesting is that there were things that went on here that appear kind of crazy, but the people in this group were not crazy at all. And I don't think they would have gone along with something as, killing people en masse or mass suicide or something like that. When you interview these people, they're quite, interesting, smart, thoughtful people who have moral values. And so I don't think they would have gone along with that. There were lots of people who dropped out along the way. When this business of ransacking the house next door happened, one of the people I interviewed heard about the plan and he said, I'm out of here. This is crazy. I'm not doing this.
There's a steady decline in membership.
Yeah, that kind of happens over the course of the 1980s, particularly the late 1980s.
And Saul Newton was he also losing sort of his grip on power? I mean, he comes down with Alzheimer's, doesn't he?
Yeah. So, he's born in 1906. So by 1986, when this woman kidnaps her child, he's 80 years old. Um, by 1988, he is beginning to show signs of senility. Whether or not it was Alzheimer's or not, I don't know, but it was dementia in some form or other. His behavior is becoming increasingly kind of unhinged, and as well as forgetful. And then at a certain point, his sixth wife actually forces him out of the house where they're living. He's beginning to molest children, which is not a good thing, and behaving violently and unpredictably. So they get him out of there, and he's eventually hospitalized and dies in a hospital in 1991. And so with him, the group loses a lot of its glue and breaks up into factions. And there are by now more and more defections from the group. Paying all the bills becomes increasingly difficult. This group has been supported by, dues that people have to pay. And a group that starts out with 250 members, if you've only got 125, you've obviously don't have the income that you need to support the whole thing. So they're selling off their real estate. People who have left the group are suing them because they want to get their money back out of the building they bought. And all these things are happening at the same time that basically make it impossible to function as a group any longer.
Let me end sort of going back to the beginning with Harry Stack Sullivan. Now, he's the guy that the Sullivanians are named after, even though he wasn't around when they formed, but he was influential, over Jane Pierce, who was a student and one of the founders of the Sullivanians. Harry Stack Sullivan, how is he remembered today? Is he remembered for his own theories? Is he marred by what would come after him?
He is he is remembered and very respected in psychoanalytic theory. You will rarely hear people speak ill of him, and I don't think anyone blames him for what people did in his name at the Sullivan Institute. One thing that's really interesting is I've had some inquiries. I'm supposed to give a talk at the Sullivan Institute, which Sullivan founded. I might have thought that they would want nothing to do with me in this book because the Sullivan Institute is sort of like the black sheep in the psychoanalytic family. And so instead, they want to talk about it. Okay, so where did we go wrong? How did this group that was a kind of rib out of Harry Stack Sullivan's theories, where did it go wrong? And let's kind of look at that. So I thought that was very interesting. I'm supposed to talk later this week to a group in Washington who are Sullivanian inspired, that is Harry Stack Sullivan inspired therapists operating in the Washington D.C. area because he was a psychotherapist at a famous hospital in the Maryland area for many years, which has its own kind of history.
So is it seen as like Harry Stack Sullivan? Then his ideas were, yes, mental illness happens from culture as a cause of mental illness. Group dynamics are important, but he wouldn't have gone that step of trying to break up the family.
Yeah, I think that the place where these people really went wrong was making the therapist into a kind of God. The idea that you can not only help your patients see various possibilities they may not have seen for themselves, but actually force their hand into doing things they didn't otherwise want to do. So the idea that you would tell your patients who to live with, tell your patients what to do, that's, I think, the line you cross where you really get into trouble. And so I don't think Sullivan would have done that. There's no evidence of that. It's one thing in the case of patients with schizophrenia, moving them into a group setting. It's another thing to be doing that with all the rest of your patients.
Alexander Stille has been our guest. He has joined us to talk about his book called The Sullivanians, Psychotherapy in the Wild Life of an American Commune. Alexander Stille is the San Paolo Professor of International Journalism at Columbia University. Alexander Stille, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Thank you.